The sudden crack of a gunshot across the dusty main street of Silver Creek froze Lillian Hayes mid-step. She clutched her parcel of fabric to her chest as the bullet shattered the window of the general store just inches from where she stood. The year was 1876, and dying from a stray bullet in a town dispute wasn't how she'd planned to spend her Tuesday afternoon. "Get down, madam." A strong hand gripped her elbow, pulling her behind the water trough as another shot rang out. Lillian found herself pressed against the rough wooden boards, heart hammering, staring into the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Are you hurt?" The man's voice was deep, tinged with concern as his gaze swept over her, searching for injuries. Lillian shook her head, struggling to find her voice. "No, I'm fine. Stay here." He touched the brim of his hat before rising slightly to peer over the trough, his Winchester rifle at the ready. He wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, but there was something undeniably commanding about him, the way he held himself, the calm amid chaos. "You picked a bad day to visit Silver Creek," he muttered, eyes scanning the street where two men stood in a standoff, pistols drawn. "Town's been on edge since the silver mine dispute." "I live here," Lillian corrected him, finding her voice. "Or at least, I have for the past 3 months. I'm the new schoolteacher." That earned her a glance and the hint of a smile. "Is that so? Town's been keeping secrets from me, then." Another shot cracked through the air, followed by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. "For heaven's sake," Lillian muttered. "Third gunfight this month." "Wait here," he instructed, his voice leaving no room for argument. Before she could protest, he was on his feet, moving with the fluid grace of a man who knew how to handle himself in trouble. "Hey," he called out, stepping into the street, rifle pointed skyward. "That's enough." The two men paused, their attention drawn to the newcomer. Lillian peered around the edge of the water trough, hard in her throat. "This ain't your business, stranger," one of the men snarled, a scraggly fellow with a pockmarked face. "When you start shooting up a street with innocent folks around, you make it everyone's business," the stranger replied evenly. "The lady there nearly caught your stray bullet." The two men glanced toward Lillian, momentarily chagrined. "Sheriff's riding in from the county seat tomorrow," the stranger continued. "Whatever quarrel you have, save it for then or settle it without firearms." There was something in his stance, in the quiet authority of his voice, that made both men hesitate. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, before the pockmarked man slowly holstered his gun. "This ain't over, Whitley," he spat at his opponent before stalking away. The second man glared but followed suit, backing away toward the saloon. As quickly as it had begun, the confrontation was over. The stranger turned back to Lillian, extending a hand to help her to her feet. "Thank you," she said, accepting his assistance, noticing the strength in his calloused grip. "I don't believe I caught your name." "Jackson Reed, madam." He tipped his hat. "Just passing through." "Lillian Hayes." She brushed dust from her skirts, suddenly aware of the townspeople emerging from doorways and behind barrels, the danger now past. "That was quite impressive, Mr. Reed." "Just Jackson, please." And it was nothing special. Sometimes men just need a reminder that there are consequences to their actions. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, especially when ladies are present. "Well, Jackson, I owe you my thanks." She gathered her parcels, noticing one had fallen and split open, spilling colorful fabric onto the dusty street. "Oh dear." He knelt quickly, collecting the scattered goods. "Teaching supplies?" "Yes, for the children to make decorations for Founder's Day next month." She accepted the bundle he handed her. "Are you truly just passing through? Silver Creek could use a man willing to stand up like you just did." Jackson's expression turned thoughtful. "I came to meet with Theodore Hammond about some cattle. Planning to drive a herd north come spring." "Mr. Hammond's ranch is about 3 miles west," Lillian offered. "His daughter Emma is one of my students." "Is that so?" He looked at her with new interest. "Perhaps you might point me in the right direction before another gunfight breaks out." Lillian laughed despite herself. "I'd be happy to. I'm headed that way myself." The schoolhouse is just past the crossroads on the Hammond property. As they began walking together, Lillian couldn't help but notice the curious glances from townsfolk. Single women in Silver Creek were few, and being seen with a handsome stranger would certainly start tongues wagging. but something about Jackson Reed made her feel safe rather than scandalized. "So, Miss Hayes, what brings a lady like you to a rough and tumble place like Silver Creek?" He walked beside her, leading his horse by the reins, his rifle secured in its scabbard. "The same thing that brings most people west, I suppose. A fresh start." She hesitated, then added, "My father passed last year. There wasn't much left for me in Boston." "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "Thank you. He was a teacher as well. I suppose I'm carrying on the family tradition, just with a change of scenery." They passed the last buildings of the town proper, the road stretching ahead through rolling grassland dotted with sage. In the distance, the foothills rose toward mountains still capped with the last of winter's snow. "It's beautiful here," Jackson remarked. "Different from Texas, but it has its charms." "Texas? Is that home for you?" Haven't had a place to call home for some years now." Something in his tone suggested a story there, but he didn't elaborate. The schoolhouse came into view, a simple white clapboard building with a small bell tower. Beside it stood Lillian's cottage, modest but neat with curtains in the windows and the beginnings of a flower garden out front. "That's me," she said, nodding toward the cottage. "The Hammond place is about a mile further on. You can't miss it, largest ranch house in these parts." Jackson nodded, but seemed in no hurry to continue on his way. "That's a mighty fine schoolhouse you're doing." "Partly. The town had built it, but it had been sitting empty for nearly a year before I arrived. No teacher would stay more than a month or two." She smiled wryly. Apparently, educating 28 children of varying ages and temperaments while dealing with occasional gunfights isn't everyone's idea of a desirable position. "Their loss," Jackson said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Those children are lucky to have you." Lillian felt a blush warming her cheeks. "That's kind of you to say. Would you care for some coffee before you continue on? It's the least I can offer after you saved me from becoming an unfortunate footnote in Silver Creek's history." The invitation surprised even her. Proper Boston ladies didn't invite strange men into their homes, but proper Boston ladies also didn't move alone to frontier towns. Besides, there was something about Jackson Reed that inspired trust. He hesitated, glancing toward the distant Hammond ranch, then back to her. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Not at all. I insist." She moved toward her cottage door. "You can tie your horse at the rail there." Inside, Lillian's home was simple but comfortable. Books lined the shelves, one of the few luxuries she'd insisted on bringing west, and colorful quilts brightened the plain furniture. She busied herself with the coffee pot at the stove while Jackson removed his hat, looking around with appreciation. "This is mighty welcoming, Miss Hayes." "Lillian, please. And thank you. It's not much, but I've tried to make it feel like home." She set out cups and a plate of cookies she'd baked the previous day. As they sat at her small table, she found herself curious about this man who'd stepped into danger without hesitation. "So what brings a Texas cowboy all the way to Colorado territory for cattle?" Jackson sipped his coffee before answering. "The Longhorns do well on the drive north to the railheads. I've been working as a trail boss, but I'm looking to build something of my own now. Hammond has a reputation for quality stock." "You want your own ranch?" Lillian asked. Something flickered in his eyes, a dream, perhaps. "Someday. Need to build up the herd first." Their conversation flowed easily, spanning topics from the challenges of the cattle business to Lillian's more spirited students. Before either realized, an hour had passed. "I should get on to Hammond's," Jackson said reluctantly, rising from the table. "Thank you for the coffee and company, Lillian. Will you be staying in the area long?" she asked, walking him to the door. "That depends on the business with Hammond. At least a few days, I expect." Lillian found herself hoping it would be longer. "Well, should you find yourself with free time, the school always welcomes visitors. The children love hearing stories from travelers." Jackson smiled, settling his hat back on his head. "I'd like that. Never thought I'd have anything worth teaching, but I might manage a tale or two." At the door, he paused. "Would it be too forward to call on you again? Perhaps for dinner in town, as a proper thank you for your hospitality?" The warmth in his blue eyes made Lillian's heart skip a beat. "I'd like that very much." Then it settled. He tipped his hat. "Until next time, Miss Hayes." Lillian watched him mount his horse and ride toward the Hammond ranch, a strange flutter of anticipation in her chest. She'd come west seeking independence and purpose. not romance. Yet there was something about Jackson Reed that made her wonder if perhaps life had more surprises in store than she'd imagined. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day. Lillian rang the school bell promptly at 8, smiling as her students filed in, from tiny 5-year-old Sarah Miller to 16-year-old Benjamin Taylor, who worked his family's farm but still made time for his studies. "Good morning, children," she greeted them. "Let's begin with our arithmetic." She was halfway through explaining fractions to the younger students when the door opened. Jackson Reed stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Reed," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "What a pleasant surprise. Miss Hayes." He nodded politely. "Mr. Hammond suggested I might be of use explaining cattle driving to your students. Part of their local economy lessons." 28 pairs of curious eyes swiveled between their teacher and the stranger. "Of course," Lillian recovered quickly. "Children, this is Mr. Reed, a cattle driver from Texas. He's going to tell us about his work." She gestured to an empty chair beside her desk, but instead of sitting, Jackson moved to the front of the room with an ease that surprised her. "How many of you have seen a cattle drive?" he asked. A few hands went up. "And how many of you have tasted beef that was walked all the way from Texas?" More hands rose. For the next half hour, Jackson captivated the class with tales of thundering herds, lightning storms, river crossings, and the camaraderie of cowboys on the trail. He explained the economics of the business in terms the children could understand, and even taught them a few words of Spanish used by the vaqueros. Lillian watched, impressed by his natural rapport with the children. When Emma Hammond asked if he'd ever shot anyone, he deftly redirected the question to talk about how cowboys protected their herds from rustlers, emphasizing brains over bullets. "The best cowboys rarely need to draw their weapons," he explained. "It's about preventing trouble before it starts." When the noon bell rang, the children groaned in disappointment. "Perhaps Mr. Reed will visit us again before he leaves," Lillian suggested, meeting his eyes with a grateful smile. "I'd be honored," he replied. As the children filed out for their midday meal, Emma Hammond lingered. "Pa says you're staying with us for a spell, Mr. Reed. Will you be at supper tonight?" "I believe I will, Miss Emma." The girl glanced between Jackson and Lillian with the knowing look of a perceptive 12-year-old. "Miss Hayes comes for supper sometimes. Ma says she needs proper feeding since she lives all alone." "Emma," Lillian chided gently, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Just saying," Emma replied innocently before skipping out the door. Alone in the schoolhouse, Lillian felt suddenly self-conscious. "You were wonderful with the children." "Thank you. It was my pleasure." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a boyish gesture that contrasted with his otherwise confident demeanor. "Truth is, Hammond wasn't the one who suggested it. I rode out at dawn to see his herd, finished business quicker than expected, and found myself looking for an excuse to see you again." The directness of his admission took her breath away. In Boston, men circled for weeks with veiled intentions and proper introductions. Here was Jackson Reed, barely a day after meeting her, honestly stating his interest. "I'm glad you did," she admitted. "Though I'm not sure what the town gossips will make of it." "Let them talk," he said with a shrug. "I've never put much stock in what others think. A luxury not afforded to schoolteachers, I'm afraid." She began organizing papers on her desk. "We're held to certain standards. And have I compromised those standards?" he asked, moving closer. "Not yet," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But the day is young." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that made her smile. "Fair enough. I'll mind my manners." He picked up his hat. "Hammond's wife did invite you to supper tonight. Said something about you being too thin." Lillian rolled her eyes. "Martha Hammond has taken it upon herself to fatten me up since I arrived. She seems to think Boston women are constitutionally frail." "Are you going?" She hesitated only briefly. "I believe I will. Then I'll look forward to seeing you this evening." He settled his hat on his head. "In the meantime, I promised your students I'd show them how a proper lasso works during their afternoon break. I've created a monster," she laughed. "They'll never want to return to their studies now." True to his word, Jackson returned at the afternoon recess, demonstrating rope tricks to the delighted children. Lillian watched from the schoolhouse steps, charmed by the way the usually serious older boys crowded around him with admiration, and how gently he guided the younger children's attempts with the rope. When school ended for the day, Jackson waited while she locked up the building. "May I walk you home?" he asked. Thank you, but I have papers to grade and need to change before going to the Hammonds. She smiled apologetically. I'll see you at supper. He tipped his hat respectfully. Until then, Lillian watched him go, a curious feeling in her chest. It had been a long time since she'd felt this kind of attraction to a man. Perhaps too long. That evening, dressed in her second-best dress of deep blue calico, Lillian made her way to the Hammond ranch. The sprawling house was lit up warmly against the gathering dusk, and the sound of laughter greeted her as Martha Hammond ushered her inside. There you are, dear. Come in, come in. Theodore's just opened a bottle of his special whiskey, not that you need any, of course, but the men are celebrating. The Hammond's comfortable parlor was filled with the delicious smells of roast beef and fresh bread. Theodore Hammond, a barrel-chested man with a booming voice, was holding court by the fireplace, while Jackson stood nearby, dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. His eyes found hers immediately, a smile spreading across his face that made Martha Hammond glance knowingly between them. Miss Hayes, Theodore called. Come meet our guest properly. This young man and I have just concluded the finest piece of business I've done in years. Lillian allowed herself to be drawn into the circle, hyper-aware of Jackson's presence beside her. Mr. Reed and I have agreed on terms for a joint venture, Theodore explained. He'll be driving 200 head of my best cattle to the Kansas railhead, with a share of the profits. That's wonderful news, Lillian said sincerely. Better than that, Theodore continued. He'll be wintering here afterward, helping me improve my breeding stock with some of those Texas methods. We're going to revolutionize ranching in these parts. What my husband means, Martha cut in dryly, is that Mr. Reed will be staying in Silver Creek for the foreseeable future. Jackson's eyes never left Lillian's face. If that's agreeable to everyone. More than agreeable. Theodore clapped him on the shoulder. Now, let's eat before Martha's feast gets cold. Throughout dinner, Lillian found herself engaged in lively conversation not just with Jackson, but with the entire Hammond family. Emma proudly reported that Mr. Reed had promised to teach her to throw a lasso properly, while Theodore outlined ambitious plans for expanding his ranch operations with Jackson's expertise. The drive north will take most of the summer, Jackson explained as they enjoyed Martha's apple pie. But I should be back by early fall. Just in time for the harvest dance, Emma piped up. Miss Hayes, you could go with Mr. Reed. Emma, her mother admonished, though her eyes twinkled. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. That's months away, Emma. Mr. Reed may have other plans by then. No, Jackson said quietly. I don't believe I will. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. After dinner, while Theodore showed Jackson some maps in his study and Martha supervised Emma's bedtime preparations, Lillian found herself alone on the porch, watching the stars appear in the vast Colorado sky. The door opened behind her, and Jackson's footsteps approached. Beautiful night, he said, joining her at the railing. It is. She turned to face him. Congratulations on your business arrangement. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. He looked out at the darkened landscape. I've been drifting a long while. Never thought I'd find a place that felt right to put down roots. And Silver Creek feels right. His eyes met hers. Parts of it certainly do. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. I should head back, Lillian said softly. It's getting late. I'll walk you. There's no need, there's every need, he interrupted gently. Besides, I'd welcome the company. Martha provided a lantern, and they set off down the road toward Lillian's cottage, the lights swinging between them, casting long shadows across the path. When do you leave for the cattle drive? Lillian asked. 3 weeks. Time enough to make preparations, gather supplies. That's not long. No, he agreed. Which is why I was hoping you might allow me to call on you properly during that time. When your teaching duties permit, of course. Lillian's heart quickened. I'd like that. They reached her cottage too soon for her liking. At the door, Jackson set the lantern down on the step. Thank you for walking me home, she said, suddenly shy. Lillian. He stepped closer, his expression earnest in the lantern light. I know we've only just met, but I feel like I've been looking for you without knowing it. The words should have seemed forward, even improper, but instead they resonated with something Lillian felt stirring in her own heart. I feel it too, she admitted softly. It's unexpected. His hand reached up to gently touch her cheek. May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps a ride out to the lake I spotted on Hammond's property? Yes, she whispered. I'd like that. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, but instead he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply intimate. Sleep well, Lillian Hayes. She watched him walk back toward the Hammond ranch, lanterns swinging at his side, until the darkness swallowed him. Only then did she enter her cottage, heart lighter than it had been in years. True to his word, Jackson arrived the next afternoon as school was dismissing, mounted on a handsome bay gelding and leading a gentle mare for Lillian. Mr. Hammond insisted I borrow his wife's horse for you, he explained as he helped Lillian mount. Said she's the sweetest-tempered animal in the county. The children watched wide-eyed as their teacher rode off with the handsome cowboy, and Lillian knew the town gossip mill would be working overtime by evening. Strangely, she found she didn't care as much as she might have expected. They rode through meadows bursting with spring wildflowers, Jackson pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his travels. When they reached the small lake, they dismounted in a grove of aspen trees, their new leaves shimmering in the breeze. Jackson spread a blanket he'd brought and unpacked a modest picnic bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of cider. Not exactly fine dining, he apologized. It's perfect, Lillian assured him, settling on the blanket and removing her hat. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts. Jackson spoke of growing up on a small farm in East Texas, losing his parents to fever when he was 16, and making his way as a cowhand and eventually a trail boss. Lillian told him about her father's school in Boston, her brief engagement to a banker's son that had ended when she realized she'd be expected to give up teaching, and her decision to seek a new life in the West after her father's death. You're braver than I am, Jackson said. Facing down a classroom of frontier children takes more courage than handling a stampeding herd. Lillian laughed. I don't know about that. No one's ever been trampled to death by a spelling lesson. As the afternoon waned, they walked along the lakeshore, skipping stones across the still water. When Jackson's hand found hers, it felt as natural as breathing. I've been thinking, he said as they watched a pair of ducks glide across the lake. After the cattle drive, when I come back here. Yes, Lillian prompted when he paused. I'd like to build something. A ranch of my own, eventually. The land northeast of town, near the river Hammond, says it might be available. It's beautiful there, Lillian agreed. The miller's children talk about swimming in that bend of the river in summer. Jackson turned to face her, still holding her hand. The thing is, Lillian, I've spent years with no fixed address. Just me and the trail. But lately I've been thinking that's no way to live a full life. Her heart beat faster. What kind of life are you looking for, Jackson read? One with purpose. Roots. His blue eyes held her steadily. Maybe someday a family. The word hung between them, full of possibility. That sounds like a fine ambition, she managed to say. And you? What are you looking for out here in Silver Creek? Lillian looked out across the water, considering. When I came west, I was running from memories, looking for independence. I wanted to prove I could make my own way. She turned back to him. But I'm starting to think that independence doesn't have to mean being alone. Jackson's smile could have outshone the setting sun. No, it surely doesn't. They rode back as twilight settled over the land, a comfortable silence between them. At her cottage door, Jackson finally gave in to what they'd both been feeling all day, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on her lips. Good night, Lillian, he whispered. May I see you tomorrow? Yes, she replied, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. Yes, you may. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind. Between her teaching duties and his preparations for the cattle drive, they stole whatever time they could together. Jackson became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse, teaching the children about the stars cowboys used for navigation and demonstrating how to read weather patterns. In the evenings, they often walked through town or sat on Lillian's porch swing, talking until the stars came out. Sometimes they rode out to the lake or picnicked in the meadows. Once, they attended a town social together, causing a stir among the locals who had quickly noted the blossoming romance between the new schoolteacher and the Texas cowboy. Most found it charming. A few raised eyebrows at the speed of their attachment. Lillian paid little mind to the latter. For the first time in her life, she was following her heart rather than convention, and it felt gloriously right. The night before Jackson was to leave with the cattle drive, Theodore and Martha Hammond hosted a small dinner in his honor. Afterward, Jackson asked Lillian to walk with him under the stars. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver pendant on a chain, a star with a tiny pearl at its center. "It's not much, but when I saw it in the general store, it made me think of you." "It's beautiful," Lillian whispered as he fastened it around her neck. "When I'm on the trail, I'll look up at the North Star and think of you," he said. "Steady, bright, guiding me home." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "I'll miss you." "These months will pass quicker than we think," he promised. "And I've spoken with Hammond about writing letters. He'll include them with his business correspondence to contacts along the trail." "I'll write every week," she promised. He drew her close, his kiss deeper and more urgent than before. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Lillian Hayes, I know it's fast, and I know some might say it's foolish to feel so much so soon, but I need you to know I'm falling in love with you." Joy burst like sunshine in her chest. "I'm falling in love with you too," Jackson read. They stood entwined under the vast starry sky, reluctant to part, but knowing the separation ahead would only strengthen what they'd found together. "Come back to me," Lillian whispered against his chest. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised. "I'll be thinking of you every step of the trail." The next morning, Lillian stood with the Hammonds and other townspeople to watch as Jackson and the hired cowboys moved the herd out. He spotted her in the crowd and rode over, leaning down from his saddle. "Remember what I said," he told her. "North Star." "I'll be watching it too," she replied. With a tip of his hat and one last lingering look, he rejoined the drive, soon becoming just a distant figure among the dust and cattle. Lillian touched the star pendant at her throat and whispered, "Come back to me." The summer stretched long and hot. Lillian threw herself into her teaching, adding special projects to keep both the children and herself occupied. She started a school garden, organized a community play, and even began evening literacy classes for adults who'd never had the chance to learn reading. Each night, she wrote to Jackson by lamplight, filling pages with the daily happenings of Silver Creek and the deepening feelings in her heart. His letters came less frequently, carried by travelers or mail coaches connecting with the cattle trail, but each one was a treasure she read and reread until the paper grew soft at the folds. He wrote of magnificent sunsets and star-filled nights, of river crossings and the camaraderie of the trail crew. Between descriptions of life on the drive, he included lines that made her blush and smile. "At night when the herd is settled and the camp is quiet, I take out the small sketch you gave me and try to remember the exact sound of your laugh. The wildflowers here reminded me of the day at the lake. I picked one thinking to send it, but it withered too quickly, unlike my feelings for you, which grow stronger with each passing mile. I find myself planning the house I'll build large windows to catch the morning light, because I remember you saying how you love to wake with the sun. Is it too forward to ask if you might someday want to see those plans?" In late August, a thunderstorm damaged the schoolhouse roof. Theodore Hammond organized repairs, and while the men worked, Martha confided to Lillian that Jackson's letters to them spoke constantly of his return and his intentions. "He's asked Theodore about available land 3 times now," Martha said with a knowing smile. "And not just any land, good land for a proper family homestead." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "We've only known each other a short time. Sometimes that's all it takes," the older woman replied. "Theodore proposed to me after 2 weeks. We've had 30 years together and never a regret." When September arrived, bringing cooler air and turning leaves, Lillian found herself watching the trail from town more frequently. According to Jackson's last letter, they had successfully delivered the cattle to the railhead in Kansas and were making good time on the return journey. "Expect us by the harvest moon," he'd written. "I have so much to tell you, Lillian. So much to ask." The harvest moon came, casting its golden light over ripening fields, but no sign of Jackson and the returning cowboys. Lillian tried not to worry. Travel in the West was unpredictable, delays common. Still, she found herself distracted during lessons, her eyes drawn to the classroom window and the road beyond. 3 days after the harvest moon, Lillian was helping her students decorate the schoolhouse for their autumn celebration when a commotion outside drew their attention. Emma Hammond was the first to the window. "Rider's coming," she exclaimed. "It's Pa and the men from the drive." The children rushed outside, Lillian following more sedately, though her heart raced. Through the swirl of dust and horses, she searched for one face. And there he was, tanned darker than before, leaner from the hard journey, but unmistakably Jackson, his blue eyes finding hers across the schoolyard. He dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to one of the other cowboys without looking away from her. Lillian was vaguely aware of the children's excitement, of Theodore Hammond's booming voice announcing the successful drive, but all she could focus on was Jackson walking toward her, removing his hat, a smile breaking across his face that mirrored the joy in her own heart. "Miss Hayes," he said formally, mindful of their audience. "Mr. Reed," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Welcome back to Silver Creek. It's good to be back." His eyes said so much more than his words. "Might I call on you this evening? I believe we have much to discuss." "I would like that very much." The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Lillian dismissed the children early, citing the special occasion of the cowboy's return, though everyone knew the real reason. She hurried home to change from her teaching clothes into her best dress, a deep green that brought out the gold in her hair. Jackson arrived promptly at sunset, freshly bathed and shaved, wearing clean clothes and carrying a small bouquet of late wildflowers. "You look beautiful," he said when she opened the door. "You look like yourself again," she replied, taking the flowers. "The trail dust suited you, but I prefer seeing your face clearly." Inside, over coffee and the apple cake Lillian had hastily baked that afternoon, Jackson recounted the journey in greater detail, the difficulties they'd faced, the triumph of delivering the herd at a premium price, the contacts he'd made for future business. "Hammond's beside himself with the profits," he explained. "He's already talking about increasing the herd for next year's drive." "And you?" Lillian asked. "What are your plans now?" Jackson set down his coffee cup and reached across the table to take her hands. "That depends entirely on you, Lillian." Her heart skipped a beat. "On me. I've spent 3 months thinking about what I want for my future. I knew before I left, but the time away only confirmed it." He squeezed her hands gently. "I want to build a life here. I've already spoken to Hammond about purchasing land that piece by the river we talked about. He's willing to back me as a partner in starting my own operation." "Jackson, that's wonderful. But none of it matters without you." He rose from his chair, still holding her hands, drawing her to her feet. "These past months showed me that success, land, cattle, they're hollow achievements if you're facing them alone." Lillian's breath caught as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I know it's fast. I know people will talk. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "Lillian Hayes, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here?" Tears of joy sprang to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Jackson, I will." His face lit with such happiness that it nearly took her breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the longing of their months apart. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't want just a kiss, Lillian. I want a life with you. A home, a family, growing old together, watching the seasons change over our land." "That's what I want too," she assured him, her hands framing his beloved face. "All of it with you." They agreed to a spring wedding, giving them time to prepare properly. Theodore Hammond insisted on announcing the engagement at church the very next Sunday, beaming like a proud father as he shared the news with the congregation. Most of the town turned out for the announcement, offering congratulations that ranged from warmly enthusiastic to politely surprised at the speed of the courtship. "Let them talk," Jackson whispered to Lillian as they accepted well wishes after the service. "We know what we've found is real." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Jackson began construction on their home, a handsome 2-story house on the river property with the large windows he'd promised in his letters. Lillian continued teaching, but spent her free time helping with the building and preparing for their future together. They faced challenges, of course. A harsh, early winter delayed construction. The school board questioned whether Lillian should continue teaching after her marriage. A competing rancher tried to challenge Jackson's claim to the river property. But together, they weathered each storm, growing stronger in their bond. By March, with the first signs of spring emerging from the snow, the house was nearly complete. Jackson had assembled a small but respectable herd as the foundation for their ranch, and Lillian had won her battle with the school board, securing her position at least through the end of the term. Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. The entire town turned out for the ceremony in the white-clapboard church, followed by a celebration that spilled into the streets of Silver Creek. Martha Hammond had helped Lillian create a simple but elegant wedding dress, and Emma proudly served as her attendant. Theodore stood as Jackson's best man, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that he'd known from the first day these two were meant for each other. As Jackson and Lillian exchanged their vows, she wore the silver star pendant he'd given her the night before he left, a reminder of the time they'd spent apart and the certainty that had grown during that separation. "I, Jackson, take you, Lillian, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Lillian repeated the words, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson's kiss was both a promise and a fulfillment. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and more than a few emotional toasts from their friends. As the sun began to set, Jackson led Lillian to a waiting buggy decorated with flowers and ribbons by her students. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, his eyes shining with love. "More than ready, Mr. Reed," she replied, squeezing his hand. They drove through the gathering dusk to their new house on the river, the windows glowing with lamplight that Martha and some of the other women had arranged as a wedding gift. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and fresh flowers adorned the tables. "It's perfect," Lillian breathed, turning slowly to take in what would be their home. "Not quite," Jackson said, sweeping her into his arms. "Now it's perfect." That night, as they lay entwined in their new bed, listening to the gentle sound of the river outside their window, Lillian traced the contours of her husband's face in the moonlight. "Are you happy?" she whispered. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You've given me everything I never knew I needed, Lillian Reed. And you've given me a home I never knew I was looking for," she told him. In the years that followed, the Reed Ranch flourished. Jackson's knowledge of cattle and Theodore Hammond's backing combined to create one of the most successful operations in the territory. Lillian continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Sarah after Lillian's mother. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, James, who had his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. As the children grew, so did the ranch and their happiness. Lillian eventually returned to teaching part-time, establishing a small school on their property for their children and those of neighboring ranchers. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised Lillian with a special gift, a small cabin built near the lake where they'd picnic during their courtship. "Our private retreat," he explained as he showed her the cozy interior. "Somewhere we can escape when life gets too busy." "It's wonderful," she said, embracing him. "But you know, I've never needed to escape our life. Every day with you feels like a gift." Even when the cattle break through the fence and James decides to try riding the new colt without permission, Jackson teased, referring to incidents from the previous week. Lillian laughed. Even then. Especially then. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset reflect on the lake, Jackson put his arm around his wife and pulled her close. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden into Silver Creek that day? If you hadn't been crossing the street at precisely that moment?" Lillian rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes. But then I think perhaps we would have found each other anyway. Somehow. Some things are just meant to be." "Like us," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Like us," she echoed. "And everything we've built together." As the stars began to appear, including the North Star that had guided them through their separation years before, Jackson turned to his wife with the same look of wonder he'd worn the day they met. "I told you once that I didn't want just a kiss," he reminded her. "I wanted a life with you." "And what a beautiful life it's been," Lillian replied. leaning in to kiss the man who had changed her world with a chance encounter and the courage to follow his heart. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their ranch cattle lowing softly, a cowhand singing as he made his evening rounds, the gentle rush of the river that watered their land. All around them stretched the home they'd built together, a testament to the love that had blossomed between a Boston schoolteacher and a Texas cowboy in the wild heart of the West. As night settled fully over their land, Jackson and Lillian Reed walked hand in hand back to their home, their hearts as full as the moon rising over the eastern hills. They had found in each other not just love, but purpose, partnership, and the most precious gift of all, a shared life, rich with challenges overcome and joys multiplied by being experienced together. 10 years after that fateful day in Silver Creek, the Reed Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in Colorado. Their home, once a new construction on empty land, was now the heart of a thriving operation that employed a dozen men and supported their growing family, which had expanded to include a third child, little Margaret, now 3 years old. On warm summer evenings, Jackson would often sit on their wide front porch, watching Lillian gather the children for bedtime, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. From a rootless cowboy with nothing but his horse and saddle to his name, he had become a respected rancher, a husband, a father, a man with deep roots in the community and in the hearts of those who loved him. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian would sometimes ask, catching his contemplative expression as she joined him on the porch after the children were asleep. "How lucky I am," he would reply, drawing her close. "How one moment, one decision, can change everything." And on those nights, as the stars winked into existence above their land, they would often reminisce about their beginning, the gunfight that brought them together, the swift courtship interrupted by the cattle drive, the letters that bridged the distance, and the proposal that started their shared journey. "I knew from that very first day," Jackson would confess, "when I saw you standing there in the street, so brave and composed even with bullets flying. It took me until our picnic at the lake," Lillian would tease. "I'm more cautious than you." But they both knew that some loves need no caution, only the courage to recognize when something rare and precious has found you, and the wisdom to hold on with both hands. And so they did, through all the seasons of their lives together, their love as enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel over their home, as life-giving as the river that nourished their land, and as constant as the North Star that had guided them back to each other across the vast distances of the wild, untamed West.